Hello, lovely Hopepunk interviewee viewers, and thank you so much for joining us. And today we are talking to Dean Burnett, who I'll introduce in a moment. But firstly, let me introduce the project to anyone who's watching, either live or in the future. Hopepunk is a project that is Arts Council funded. That's hoping to create a show all about. Was originally going to be about hope and about how to process difficult emotions, how to find hope when things seem hopeless. And what it's now kind of morphed into is recovery, how to find recovery, not only from hopeless moments, but also from mental illness and trauma, because as we've discovered on all of these interviews, and please feel free to go back and watch some of the other ones that we've done, that we've all kind of agreed as interviewees that the recent pandemic has been a societal trauma. We've had to interrupt our lives, and a lot has changed very quickly, and there's a lot of uncertainty, and that is all similar to the experiences of trauma, whether that's PTSD, CPTSD, and we're going to cover all of that in this interview with my lovely guest today, who is author, comedian, and most importantly, excitingly for me, is neuroscientist, Dean Burnett. Dean, thank you so much for joining me.
Happy to be here, and thank you for having me, Julia.
And thank you so much for being here.
I'm not very good with replying to introductions, it turns out. That's something I've just discovered about myself. So handy.
Well, I'm really excited to chat with you today because, we've spoken to lots of different people over the course of these interviews, mainly people who've experienced traumatic experiences themselves, whether that's in childhood or during adulthood. And I know that you have your own experience of trauma as well. But before we get onto that, I'd just like to explain a little bit about yourself, because you're a neuroscientist and author. You're also Rethink Mental Illness ambassador, just like I am, for amazing charity illness. Can you tell us a bit about the books that you've written first? Because it's nearly Christmas and people might want to buy some of them.
That's true, yes. I've got 4 books out at the moment. Currently in the process of editing the 5th and pitching the 6th, so keep chugging along. So I've sort of, it's a weird thing, I sort of became an author by accident. It was never actually a long-term plan. It was, at best, it was a case of, when I was a lot younger, thinking, oh, I like writing, maybe I can write a book one day. But it's like saying, maybe I'll go to Mars one day. It's just a pipe dream, never going to happen. No one expects that. Or maybe I'll own a jetpack. No, just idle fantasy. But started writing for the, just about brains and stuff and science, and it was the humorous way to incorporate my comedy experience. And picked up by The Guardian, became popular there, and I got approached by an agent saying, you thought about writing a book? I thought about it, but didn't think it would come to anything. And then I sort of, got this book deal. I thought, I'll put everything I wanted to say about the brain in one book. My first book, The Idiot Brain, because I was sort of, as a neuroscientist, I was very wary, sometimes resentful of the way the brain is treated so mystically. So with such profound, almost worship in the mainstream, like the brain is amazing, it can do this, it can do that. It's so incredible. If you work with it any length of time, you realize it's a very messy, fallible, counterintuitive organ. So I thought I'd do a book all about the many ways which the brain is rubbish. It's called The Idiot Brain, and it took off. It was a lot of people wanted to hear that. And then my publisher was saying, so what's your second book? Like, second book? This wasn't part of the discussion. So then I couldn't think of what to write about. So people kept telling me, just write about whatever makes you happy. So that led to The Happy Brain, a book about all the things that make us happy and why. And then got approached to do one for children, or young teens and older children, why your parents are driving at the wall, what to do about it. Just sort of like a parenting guide, but inverted. It's a guide for younger people to explain why their parents are being so annoying and thoughtless or pig-headed or whatever. Because it's always the other way around, isn't it? And I think that's really unfair. My latest one is Psychological, all about how mental health works in the brain and why it often goes wrong, based on close to 20 years of neuroscience experience and nearly 10 of psychiatry lecturing and writing about it. So those are my current tomes. If anyone's interested, please. I'm always happy to talk.
I am incredibly interested. I'm gutted that I hadn't read them before interviewing you. I really needed to.
Most people haven't. It's fine.
I'm very excited to read them, though. From my perspective, I was sectioned under the Mental Health Act when I was 17, and I've been in and out of hospital 5 times. Been diagnosed with 13 different mental health conditions, but like many people with complex post-traumatic stress disorder, which was my final 13th diagnosis, you're laughing there because I feel like you probably know that that's very common, right? That I read somewhere that you get diagnosed between 10 and 15 different mental health conditions, and then somebody goes, have you thought about it might be CPTSD? And
it's more common than not. We have so many friends who finally arrive at the ultimate diagnosis, which like, oh, this one makes the most sense. But it's also like there's no guarantee that's the last one either.
It's the big level boss for me. Is like, I feel like it's like in a video game when you get to the final one, you're like, oh, I thought all the others, like anorexia was the first one to be noticed and diagnosed, but then as you kind of go along, you're like, oh no, I exhibited problems with obsessive compulsive disorder and anxiety disorder and bipolar disorder, and all of that was because of complex trauma. So, Dean, I'm so excited to talk to you about this because, I've inhaled about 12 different textbooks about neuroscience and trauma over the summer, to the point of which I've had about 4 or 5 different friends of mine say to me, I think you've done too much.
Can lead to that, yeah.
You seem to have lost your personality and you can't talk about anything else anymore.
That does, when you find something you're just interested in, which speaks to you like that, you can't help it, can you? You just get, right, this is my thing now, and then I've lost so much time not thinking about this thing, and I'm going to make up for it. And
exactly, that was exactly it. It was that it just explains 30 something. 30. Oh yes, Dean, I am over 30. Oh, thank you so much for noticing that I look so much younger than that.
Don't have to say anything, bro. Yeah, I agree with everything you just said. Yep.
I heard you. It might have been the recurring audible hallucinations that I've also experienced, but I heard you. It was like reading up about this, and this was the first book that I read about it, and I highly recommend it. The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. Obviously not as good as your books, I'm sure.
I don't know. I can't make that claim. That's unfair to everyone involved.
Well, this book was the first one that it was recommended to me by one of the friends that said, I think you've read too many books now, but it completely revolutionized my understanding of all of these mental health experiences that I've had up till now, which is why I'm so excited to chat to you today about what goes on inside this skull of ours, and why certain parts of it fire off in different ways when you experience either trauma as an adult or pervasive trauma as a child. So we're going to come on to that. But firstly, to more personalize the story, I understand that you've had your own experience of trauma very recently.
Yeah, I mean, it's been an interesting journey for me personally, in that obviously I've been talking about mental health and going through this stuff for best part of 10 years now. I think it was 2015 I started, or 14, maybe, either way. But the one thing I've always said, like I've always talked about just the pure science behind it, because as touch wood, I've never experienced any mental health problems of my own. Everyone has up and down days and all that, but nothing clinical, nothing incapacitating. I always had functionality, and I felt like I'll stick to the science, because I don't have any personal experience of dealing with mental health problems. And although we have discussions about it shouldn't be too personal, it shouldn't be just one person's story and that's it. But then obviously pandemic hit, and I thought I was quite well set up for it. I work from home, I have my little outside office, all my work's done remotely anyway, and so I thought, I'm going to write this out quite well. But very early on in the pandemic, my 50-year-old father contracted COVID and died within a month, completely out of the blue, unexpected. He had no prior health problems. He wasn't even 60, and I couldn't be there with him. I couldn't see him at any point. I had to say goodbye to him on a WhatsApp call. He's in hospital alone, and had to deal with the grief and the fallout during lockdown. So I couldn't have any family come to help me. I got 2 small children who were like at home, constantly scared, worried, upset, and I had to be their father. I had to step up and be the responsible adult, despite enduring the worst pain of my life and maintaining presentation. So I went through some very, very difficult experiences, and the grief is harder for the best of times. But when you're denied all the things that normally come with grief, you expect people to rally around. You expect to be with your family, to share the memories and the pain and the emotions. I mean, just being cut off from all that. You couldn't even have people go to the shops for me, really, because it was lockdown. There was no way to do that. And I've come out the other side of that now, and never will come out of it fully, but people have asked a lot, and I think it's a valid point that does me being did me being a neuroscientist who studies and writes and talks about this stuff all the time, did it help in my coping with the grief and the trauma of it all? And I'll say yes, I certainly think it did give a certain a certain protective factor to it, in that when I was experiencing things, I could say, oh, I'm experiencing this stage of it, and I sort of didn't know what to expect, but I sort of I had ideas, and things weren't scary for me that I was experiencing this, that, and the other. So I know I had a certain level of insight. But the comparison I make, it's sort of like being a neuroscientist going through grief. It's like being a train mechanic stuck in a car on the motorway with no brakes. You may know what the problem is, and you can understand what's happened, but you can't do anything about it until the car has stopped. You've got to ride this out, and it's still the risk of that. You've still got to keep your wits about you. You've got to be mindful of the journey you're going on, and you've got to watch the hazards. So it's still very dangerous, or it's still a big risk, or it's still a scary process. But just because you know what's happening doesn't mean it's less so. And that's sort of that's how I think of it. Yes, I have all this information in my brain about what's happening to me, but it's still the same brain that I'm using to experience these emotions, and I can't separate the two out. And that's book 5, by the way. That's it's very much an in-depth deep dive into what I went through. So that's how I cope with things. It turns out, I write about them extensively with references.
I share that coping mechanism. So I think it's something about creativity that it can be helpful with processing, but it can be as simple as something like journaling, which just helps you reflect and introspect. It doesn't have to become a book necessarily. It can just become part of learning.
Sort of a big part of it, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I love that. I like that analogy of being a car mechanic but driving a car. My car's been broken quite it keeps breaking down, and it has done a number of times in a variety of different ways. The bumpers come off, the wheels have come off at some points, and I want to ask you, why is it that some of us have mental health conditions, seem prone to having it? Is it something that we're born with in our brains? Is it a chemical thing? Or, because I'm asked this all the time, and I come up with, well, I think scientists say it's nature versus nurture. It's a 50-50, but I would like to ask you, so I can definitively answer that question to others in the future. Why is it that some people are prone to mental health conditions?
Like you say, it's a mixed bag of underlying causes and reasons. There will be genetic factors. Like pretty much all well-known mental health problems have a genetic component or a hereditary component. If your parents or members of your immediate family have depression or anxiety, the odds of you having those conditions are higher. But that's a very different thing. People hear that and they think, oh, there's a depression gene, there's an anxiety gene. If you have that, you will have depression. If you don't, you won't. No, it's all about risk factors, because the things are, our minds are the end result of so many different convoluted, complex, intricate processes happen in our brain. We're talking millions of things combining to create your mind, your ultimate consciousness. We still don't know how the brain does that. Why does the hundreds of billions of cells transferring electrochemical signals back and forth result in one cohesive mind? That's one for the philosophers, I suppose, but we're not close to understanding that yet. But all those different processes contribute. And if you've got a certain gene, which is like a less helpful version of that gene, one of those processes will be less efficient or won't contribute as much as it should, or will put out wrong signals, which means the ultimate whole is compromised in some way. And we'll still get by. There's loads of redundancy in there, but it's like a drop of ink into a large pool. It's still going to be a bit darker, a bit murkier, even if you can't notice it. But then over time this can add up. So if you've got certain genetic factors can lead to your brain being slightly compromised, which increases your odds. So rather than you have a 2% chance of depression, you might have a 2.5, which is overall nothing much to worry about. You can still live a perfectly normal life without any depression. Just the chance of you developing it are higher. So there's that genetic component. And say nature and nurture is a big thing too. Your genes are not your brain. They're a contributing factor. But they do also, the way you develop, the way you grow, the environment you develop in plays a major role as well. Because our brain, our minds is ultimately the end result of all the different connections in our brain. And these connections form from birth to end of our life, really, based on the things we experience, the knowledge we take in, the encounters we have, the things our senses deal with, the emotions we produce, and how we attach them to things. All these things create the ultimate, construction, which is the network and all the links that our brain is, which makes us what we are. And if you encounter unpleasant things, negative things, really deeply distressing things, especially at a young age, that will shape your brain in ways which, if not addressed, if not remedied early on, will have lasting impact. I mean, I think a lot of the studies show that it's age 4, which seems to be a particularly formative age. So if you think about it in terms of brain development, from if your life is like a car journey, speaking back to the car metaphor, from age 0 to 3, we're sort of packing the car, putting all the things in place. Going along, maybe moving house, or going on a long trip, put the suitcase on. If you've got enough underwear, if you packed your phone charger, but at that point, you still got time to sort of undo it. Oh, bad thing happened, but it's now it's stopped happening, so your brain can address it. Once age 4 is reached, you sort of like set off. So any mistakes that happen at this point, well, I guess I'll have to try and find a workaround for that. So things happen in your life as well, and a lot of it boils down to stress, which is like the physical and chemical process of stress. It's it's a deeply fundamental thing. Stress. It's bandied about so much at the moment because it's such a common thing, and it is, and that's no one's arguing that. But like, I'm stressed. I'm feeling stressed. I'm stressed at work. I'm stressed about this, the economy, politics, and stuff. And the stress is like a really fundamental process. It's like the precursor, the build-up to the fight or flight response. So you mentioned on like the final diagnosis being the big boss. Well, in this, using that same thing, if the fight or flight response, the ultimate panic to wade in or run away reaction, is the big boss, stress is all like the minions, like all the little soldiers or little troops you have to wade through to get to that big boss. And they might not be as big or as powerful, but they are still dangerous and damaging. They can weigh you down and they can break you without you ever getting there. It depends on how much resources you've got. And there's something in psychiatry called the stress vulnerability model, because stress is something we have to deal with. The brain has to deal with stress. Like, we got this stress. How do we stop the stress? The chemicals, the neurological reactions to it. How do we process that? You're going to do it, but the brain has a finite ability because the brain is a finite organ. So if you have if you can handle 100 points of stress and then you experience 102 points of stress, you will become mentally unwell. Your brain will stop being able to function because there's too much stress to be to be dealing with.
Yeah.
Some people can have 200 points of stress. So if they have 102 stressful experience, they can handle that. They'll bounce back from it. And a big part of it is that some people have both genetic and environmental factors, which mean their brain's ability to handle stress has already been used up to a certain extent. If you have a traumatic childhood and all the memories and emotions that come from that, your brain's ability to handle more stress will be reduced. Like I've compared it to a suitcase. So like you have a suitcase full of stress that your brain can handle. And if you've had a hard life or a hard childhood or live in a sort of high crime, high poverty, deeply uncertain situation, that suitcase is like partly filled with rocks already. It's not helpful, but you got to carry it. So your capacity to fill any more that is not, you can't handle much more than it can't handle as much as it should because it's already taken up. So combination of all these things, you can have genetic vulnerabilities, you can have neurological vulnerabilities which come from growing up and having to deal with negative experiences, and you can have later life stress. It doesn't need to be one traumatic incident. It can be chronic. It can be like a buildup of lots of different things. Because if you're having a bad time in work, that's not one particular incident. It's just I'm not paid enough. I mean, my job is very precarious. My boss is neglectful or a bully, and my coworkers are gossipy and spiteful. These are all individual things which by themselves might not be too upsetting, but combined they add to a lot of stress. And if you're trying to work 2 jobs to make ends meet, or 3, and you have children, if you're a single parent, these are all things which build up and absorb the brain's ability to handle stress. And if that ability is exceeded, usually that's when a mental health problem occurs. And the physiology of that is a whole other thing.
I mean, I love that. Again, another analogy that I adore is the bags that you carry and the rock that you might have in. It's not useful, but you still have to carry it because, yeah, people say some people have a lot of baggage, and it turns out that my baggage has a lot of rocks in it.
Yeah. So from the concept of emotional baggage. Like you're just carrying this stuff around. You don't want to, but you got to. It's yours. So,
And I want to ask you whether we can unpack that baggage, but I also am very keen to talk about the map of the brain. So what are the main parts of the brain? Let's start there. Can you kind of give us an idea of what areas are the main key areas that we're talking about when we're talking about mental health?
Well, a lot of people looked at the triune model, which is, you've probably heard the phrase your reptile brain. That's basically the most fundamental, low down, basic part of the brain, which is like the housekeeping stuff, the basic physiological, the brain stem. That's the stuff that keeps you alive, keeps you breathing, keeps your blood going, keeps your hormones in and out, and your reflexes, your basic reflexes, the stuff you need for day-to-day survival, just on the most basic physical level. And it's called reptile brain because reptiles have this too. It's such a fundamental part of the brain. It goes back, in the evolutionary lineage to dinosaur times and beyond, because it's the part that allows you to live. And some people think it means we have a reptile tendency to it. No, I think it's just a comparison to reptiles are a much older species than us, and they have the same thing. So mammals. Out of that, you've got what most people think of as the limbic regions, or the animal, or even the mammal regions. And because obviously, think of the brain like a mushroom. It starts with a stalk, and then out of that came this bit, and out of that came the next bit. So the middle bit, the mammal brain, is your emotions, like your powerful emotions and your memory. These are complex things that we can do that other species can't so well. And we have a very rich memory system, a very rich sensory ability. But other mammals share this too. It's complex, more complex than the reptile stuff, but it's still kind of fundamental to who we are. We don't have conscious control over our emotions or our memory or our sensory processing or our laughter response and things like that. And out of that came the neocortex, which is the human brain, essentially. It's a big wrinkly part on top, as you see when you look at a brain. That is alarmingly large in our species. It doubled in size over the space of 2 million years, which is frighteningly fast in terms of the evolutionary time scale. But that's where we are. That's where our conscious thought, our language abilities, our complex visual processing, that's all in there as well. And the front of the part of the brain, the frontal lobes, like from this there forward, that is that's where the real complex stuff happens, the human stuff, like the self-control, self-awareness, intelligence, applied thinking, like the ability to handle abstract information, and that internal narrative that comes from there as well, and the retrieval of memories and stuff. So these are all important parts. But when it comes to mental health, a lot of it, and this is actually one of the main thrusts of the idiot brain, is that the human part, the clever part of the brain, say, evolved over 2 million years, which is really fast. But the underlying parts of the brain, they're still kind of the same. They haven't really changed that much in like the tens and hundreds of millions of years that we've had them. So what we've got with the human brain is sort of a system where, again, back to analogies, you try to install like Windows 11 on a 6-year-old laptop. You can do it, but neither side of the agreement is particularly happy about this arrangement. Like if the laptop's going, I wasn't built for this, and the Windows going, you haven't got enough what I need here. Like you're doing this all wrong. So you end up with this really sort of begrudging system where, all right, I'll do it, but both sides are going to complain regularly, and that's sort of what we have. We have this higher brain system which can conceptualize all these stuff, bolted onto this kind of not underpowered but more primitive underlying system. And it's sort of like the young buck versus the old hand. They're just constantly butting heads internally. So one of the problems is that our sort of fancy human brains, we can simulate, we can think, like we can extrapolate, we can plan, we can imagine things happening, and we do it all the time. Okay, so if I do this, that'll happen, or if I do this in work, I'll get this result. It's a really important skill. But we are, because of the way we work, we're so prone to look for threats and dangers. And we imagine them too. Oh God, if I say this to my boss, I'm going to get fired. Or if I don't do this in time, I'm going to lose my job. Or if this merger goes through in work, I'm taking the work example, which is a big source of stress. What if they reorganize my department and I lose my job? And my mother's gone to the shops and stuff, but she hasn't called me back in 3 hours. She might have fallen or something, she might be hurt, or she's going to see a friend. Or if they have the COVID stick, we can easily imagine all these scenarios whereby things go wrong, because it's our brain's innate nature to want to anticipate threats, and therefore, the more you anticipate, the better prepared you are for it. But we create these simulated scenarios, and they link to the more fundamental part of the brain, the emotional part, which doesn't tell the difference between simulated and real by and large. So, this part of the brain is evolved to think, okay, I can see a tiger, I should run. I'm scared. I run and avoid that. But like they're probably saying, well, there's a merger going ahead. What if I lose my job? And the other part of the brain thinks, tiger, yeah, tiger, cool, run, scared. So we're having the same stress response to imagined scenarios that we would to a genuine predator in front of us in the olden days. And that's sort of why stress is so common, that it's almost like the brain's become a victim of its own success. We can, we have the intellectual power now to envisage any number of dangers and threats and prepare for them. But the very act of imagining them causes us to experience the same fundamental stress response. So we've created a world around us which is just full of dangers and risks and threats that our brain is just constantly reacting to. And that's why a big part of why you get so many mental health problems, why they're so common. Because I know we didn't give our brains a chance to catch up to the complex world around us before we built this incredibly intricate, complicated environment with so much going on in it. And that's a big part of it.
Dean, there's so much I want to ask you about. I mean, already I'm thinking that, because I've had experience of hallucinations, audible and visual hallucinations. I want to ask about that. That might have to be shelved for another conversation. I want to definitely say that the computer programming thing. Thank you, because one of my best friends who's been helping me through the last few months during the pandemic, where my brain just kind of went, oh no, thank you. I keep talking to him about, I think it's my brain's programming. And he's like, no, it's conditioning. And I'm like, no, I think it's programming. So we've had some, I'm going to tell him to watch this interview so that he can, I can say, somebody else agrees with me, programming. I want to ask you about how we can reprogram our brains, because neuroplasticity is real. But let's start with PTSD and CPTSD. So I know that those two things are different. I'd love to hear your reasons, like your distinction between the two, because you're talking about those parts of the brain. So say somebody whose brain from the years of 0 to 3, when you're packing that car, you're loading up the car, and then from the years of 4 onwards, and you've set off on the journey. What if during that time, during the packing of the car and the setting off of the journey, there has been a tiger right there? I'm speaking in metaphors. We're mixing our analogies now, but there's some sort of threat that really is there, and everyone around you is responding to that as well. So that's what's being modeled for you through other people's behaviors. How does that affect the forming of the brain?
Yeah, very, very, very profoundly is a big part of that. It's like when you're a child, you on the neurological level, children's brains are forming new connections at a terrifying rate, because everything's new, and you're still trying to figure out how the world works. And as far as your young brain is concerned, everything might be important, so it takes in all these things. And actually, if you see sort of slides of neurological samples from like a 5-year-old brain and teenager's brain and adult brain, the teenage and adult brain actually have less connections or fewer connections. You don't want to be grammatical about it, because
I do want to be. I'm a massive pedant, so I really want to be grammatical.
So fewer plural, fewer plural things, and that is an important process. It's called pruning, because although you absorb all this stuff during your childhood, a lot of it won't be useful. Learning how to walk, talk, read, write, who your family and friends are. These are all important things, which you use often. But things like, trip to the supermarket on a Saturday morning in the middle of January and it's wet out and you want to watch a TV, that won't be a profound memory. You're like, well, that was a thing that happened. I don't need to remember that. That's of no use to me. And so when you hit adolescence, your brain gets rid of all the connections that it doesn't need. Back to the software metaphor, it's like, if you've got this laptop and just constantly downloading new programs onto it, thinking this might be useful, eventually it's going to clog things up. And they go, well, I need to clear it. I got to get rid of all this because I don't need it. I need to free up some space and let the thing work again. So the brain does that. They think, well, I don't need all this. I need to be efficient and rapid and sensible for adult life. And it starts getting rid of all these things. And that's why adolescence can be such a mentally tumultuous time, because your brain sort of getting rid of connections you've always had and updating things and sort of showing things up and making things more efficient, and things are maturing by getting rid of all these things it doesn't need. But that's a long process, and when you're adolescent, like, your mood goes a bit mad because the brain matures at different rates. So the more fundamental parts, the simpler parts of the brain with emotions, they're very complex, but they're not as complex as the human stuff, the complex intellectual stuff. So they finish maturing faster. So typing like 14, 15, say, they could be done. So your emotional systems are mature, refined, as efficient as they'll ever be. So they're powerful. Like, this is like a real powerful system now. But the part of your brain which controls emotions or responds to them or deals with them, or for self-restraint, that's still maturing. And that carries on until you're 25. There's so much to do in there. So you have this situation where the part of your brain which controls emotions or helps regulate them is still under construction, while the emotion system is like up and ready to go. So when you're a teenager, your emotions are more powerful, and you have a sort of a reduced ability to deal with them, because that's just how the brain's working right now. And that can lead to mental health problems like anxiety, when the emotional system, particularly the fear, when the amygdala becomes overly powerful compared to the part of the brain which controls it and reins it in. Or you can have like depression, where your mood system just gets completely knocked out of whack because it's too much stress going on, there's too much emotion, it can't handle, it shuts down, then it loses neuroplasticity and so on. So these things are all things that can happen. But like, I told this, people ask me then, so how does the brain know which bits are important and which bits aren't to get rid of? And usually it's the ones which have been most used. If a connection forms in the brain once and is never used again, because every time you use a connection, it's always like reinforcing it, shoring it up, adding new things to it. Those are the things the brain goes, oh, that's useful, I'll keep that. So if you have traumatic experiences as a young child, these things will produce a lot of emotions. They'll have a lot of emotional connections. They'll be really quite profound and upsetting, and particularly when they involve like your parents or close family members, because these people are a huge part of our world, of our understanding of how the world works when you're a child. Like, it's a very complex relationship between child and parent, and they lead to, they are your benchmark for, well, how do things work? How does how do people behave? How does the world work around us? And they are your security system. Usually, you're supposed to say, right, this is the person this is my baseline. I go to this person and I can explore around them. So when your parents or your family your guardians are the ones who are causing the trauma, that goes in really deep and causes very confusing emotions. But because those emotions are there, your brain thinks, well, that's an important part of the brain, because the underlying processes, the unthinking processes which clear up the brain, go, okay, so this is used a lot, leave that be. This isn't used much, get rid of that. And so they endure. They last longer. They become a bigger part of who you are as a result, because of how the brain adapts itself, modulates and matures. So yeah, these things will have a lasting impact, and you can, obviously, there will be ways to experience things and work around them. But one of the sort of, again, the problems is, like with the brain's sort of victim of its own success, is that if something is too profoundly affecting you, it'll become a big part of who you are. Then it becomes sort of like, it becomes like your brain sort of builds up around it. Like PTSD is such a problem because it's normal PTSD, not complex. Like it can't be pinned on one particular incident. Like, this is a thing that happened, and it was just too much for the brain to deal with. So, like, it causes way more emotions, and remembering it causes those emotions again. So it becomes sort of self-sustaining. Usually, you remember something, if it's emotionally upsetting or rewarding, and that fades. The emotions sort of fade, and they become better integrated into the system. Like, something's been dumped in front of the brain's door. I'm going to sweep this up and then bring this in. I need this, and so there's a system in place to do that. Emotional processing is a real big part of how the brain operates. But then something like PTSD sort of overwhelms it, and the memory of it becomes too vivid. Because if it's a scary experience, especially, your brain, like the fight or flight system, ramps up your focus and your memory. Think, right, this is a bad thing. If we make it through this, and I never want to forget this because I want to avoid it next time, like the brain's defense system. But that means that your memory of the traumatic event will be so vivid, so crystal clear, and so emotionally stimulating, you'll constantly be remembering it. And every time you do, the emotions will be refreshed. So your brain can't process it. It's sort of like trying to file a burning piece of coal into a filing cabinet. Like, no, that's not going to work. That's just going to kick out smoke and steam and ash. Like, that's ruining everything. So, your brain sort of tries to cope with that. It develops behaviors to avoid it, to stay away from it, and to not think about it. But that can be seriously disruptive. It's like if your traumatic memory is a car accident, your PTSD is caused by that, then you may avoid cars forever and just instinctively not go anywhere near them. But in the modern world, that's a serious hindrance, it's a serious incapacity thing. And as I mentioned with complex PTSD, like there's more than one thing to pin it on. So with most treatments of PTSD, it's sort of like a really enhanced version of the way people deal with phobias. There's like a gradual exposure therapy is one way to deal with phobias, because what you're trying to do is get people to encounter the trigger for their phobia without setting off the brain's fear response. Because I think I know a lot of people old school think this, like if you're afraid of spiders, just throw a spider in the face. Like it won't hurt you. Then you learn that, and then you'll not have the response. That's not how the brain works. What happens is, if you've got terribly afraid of spiders, someone comes up to you and throws a tarantula at you. Now, the tarantula may not bite you at all. It may just go, run away. So they're thinking, see, that shows you that they're harmless. They're not going to do anything. But what happens is, tarantula lands on you, your brain sees the source of your fear, kicks off all the fear responses, all the fight or flight. Your heart rate goes through the roof, your adrenaline glands are pumping everything out. You're hyperventilating, you're tense, that. It's an unpleasant experience. What the brain learns is, okay, so I encounter a spider, all of my systems run through the roof, in a really upsetting way. So logically, spiders are dangerous, so I should be afraid of them. So it's basically teaching itself that, yep, spider's dangerous because I have a massive fear response. So what they do with exposure therapy is they sort of do it slowly and gradually. So like if it's spiders, okay, so for session 1, here is a picture, it's a cartoon picture of a spider. All right, it's fair enough. Next day, here's a picture of a real spider, small one. Okay, here's a small plastic spider to play with. All right, next day, here's a video of a real small spider. Okay, I sort of handle that. Here's a video of a slightly bigger spider, and then a slightly bigger one. And the next day, it's here's a small spider in a box. What do you think of that? I like it, but I guess it's fine. Next day, here's a slightly bigger spider in a box, and sort of builds up without triggering your brain's fear response. You can learn that spiders are harmless gradually. I mean, you probably never get to the point where we are just juggling black widows. That's going to be weird. But it's you can do that. And PTSD therapy does try to do that now. Is it right? We need to slowly but surely expose you to the source of the trauma in ways your brain can handle. And then we'll learn, okay, so I can handle that much at least. And next time you can handle that much, and then push it slightly further next time. And so on until you are your brain's been able to process the trauma in increments, small chunks, and help you to come to terms with it, to deal with it, because your emotional processing, all these emotions you experience have been finally integrated into your system in a practical way that can be useful. It's not disruptive. Obviously, with CPTSD, there's a lot of different things leading to it, so it's going to be more work again to unpack all that. So it'll be a longer journey.
Because from what I understand with CPTSD, because it's those formative years, it can be so many different triggers because it's those deep memories of a certain smell or a certain color or a certain expression, and because it's so deeply embedded and repressed, those memories might not be easily accessible as the memories of somebody's experience, traumatic experience. So we've all lived through 9/11, and even yesterday I had a training day where talk of terrorism was a video that we had to watch, and a part of that was I had quite a strong response to it, and I thought I was the only one having that strong response. But then when we had the break, everybody was saying, yeah, that was quite a lot to handle actually, and we've had terrorism experiences over the last few years, and we've had political issues as well that we're all aware of. But CPTSD, if it's something that's in those formative years with the family that you're exposed to as part of those formative connection experiences, what hope is there for recovering from that through any therapy?
I mean, there's always hope of recovery. You can't ever write anyone off, because the brain is so flexible, so plastic, and so adaptable. And that's that's part of the reason. That's the main reason why it is as powerful as it is. The human brain is like incredibly diverse, and it can change all the time. And that's sort of like, it's a personal bugbear of mine when you see the headlines that scream around about like, oh, use of phones is changing children's brains. It would. Everything does. Going for a walk changes your brain. Having a fishing session changes your brain. It's you sort of be misleading there. But yeah, when it's the fundamental stuff, it is harder to do. But the brain can still achieve workarounds or use new systems or like reapproach things. It's just harder to do as an adult because your brain doesn't have the freshness, or like it's not as much of a blank canvas as when you're a child. So rather than forging new ways, you're not only learning new ways of doing things, you're trying to unlearn old ways of doing things, trying to undo old connections or work around them, which is just an inherently more complex process. It's the time it takes and the amount of time and effort you can dedicate it to it, which I think is often a limiting factor, because we all live in the real world. If you're an adult, you have to have some way to pay the bills and to find a house to live in and to just maintain the general state of life. You need to eat, to wash, to keep fit or keep healthy, whatever your priorities are. So it often means that undoing like such fundamental issues just takes more effort, it takes more time and more motivation, all of which are kind of harder to come by when you are dealing with these issues. It sort of like becomes a self-sustaining thing. So I would never say there's no hope for anyone. I think there's always hope, because the brain's good at that. It is very good at changing itself and relearning stuff. It's just do you have the scope to do it? And that's where you come into the conversation about the underfunding of mental health systems and the resources, because ideally everyone should be able to have their own therapist on hand at all times, because that would be the best case scenario. But there's not enough people to do that. There aren't enough, certainly not enough funding available at the moment. So yes, you can undo these things. You can learn to come to terms with them, and your brain can think, right, this way I've been doing things isn't helpful. I need to do a new thing. I need to do it in new ways. But it's a slow process, because there's something that fundamental. Your brain takes time and effort to work around it.
I am tearing up, Dean, because I'm on this journey right now that my question I want to ask is, how long will it take? But I have a horrible feeling that you will. I know the answer to that. I suspect it's that we don't know, because as far as it's your brain.
I think it's your brain, and I think that applies to everyone dealing with any sort of issues. And that's one of the main problems with mental health concerns, or mental health problems, disorders, whatever you want to call them, in that they are primarily a subjective experience. I cannot tell anyone else what's going on in their head. And one of the main sort of complaints about mental health care in the last decade or so, it's better now, but it's still a thing, is like the reliance on the medical model of mental health treatment, which is basically treating mental health problems like you would treat a physical one. So if someone comes in with a broken leg or a virus, doctor says, okay, tell me what's going on. I prescribe this. You go away, do this thing, come back and I'll check you again. And then, it's usually much case doctor says, I say what's what, patient, do as you're told, and then you get better. And you can't really do that with mental health problems, because you can't see them. You can't put them under a microscope. You can't attack the underlying pathogen. The individual, the patient, is a vital part of the process, and by sidelining them or sort of ignoring them, you're flying blind, essentially. You need their involvement, and you need them to their say so, and you need their contribution, because almost every mental health problem is essentially bespoke in a way, because everyone has their own mind, which is so much more variable from person to person than someone's body. Because you can tell, like, someone's body is going wrong. You can sort of tell, because humans have the same sort of body, the shape, the plan, the underlying systems, for like tens of thousands of years. Like someone in Roman times having a heart attack would look the same as someone now. Whereas I can't tell someone's mind looks like. I have no idea what's going on in there. So they have to be able to tell me. Someone comes in to a doctor surgeon, like they're leaking green fluid from every pore. You're like, oh, that isn't right. That's not meant to be happening. Or the legs point in the wrong direction. It's okay, that needs to be fixed, because that's not how legs work. But if I meet someone and they're happy one day and they're sad the next, no, I can think, oh, that seems like depression or mood swings. But also they might just had some bad news before I saw them. It looks the same from the outside. So, it's such an individual journey, the whole mental health thing. It could be faster, it could be slower, because it really depends on who the person is and what they've experienced and what they're able to invest in it, and so on and so on. So yeah, it's a really, asking how long it takes is, anyone who will tell you is probably mistaken to do so, because we can't really know.
Yes. So we've only got another 15 minutes, but for the end of our conversation, it's flown by, and I've got so many more questions I want to ask you. So for my memory, I'm going to say them all out loud. I'll ask you about left and right brain, because I'm still trying to understand really what that means. I also want to ask you about if you have an experience with another person that is traumatizing, then how can you retrain your brain to be able to be exposed to that person without it re-traumatizing you? Like, how can we help each other? Say if you've gone through a difficult experience with somebody, but then you need to take time apart to heal from it, then how can you ever come back together again?
Yeah, basically, yes, you can, but I think it really depends on the other person, in that humans are intensely social. That's one of our great superpowers. We are so interpersonal and social that we leave most other species standing. And a lot of people would think that's ridiculous, because they look at the news or spend 18 seconds on Twitter, you see people are very unpleasant to each other. But in terms of how many humans there are on this planet and how rarely we actually do anything bad to each other, it's actually quite impressive. So I said this in talks. Like, I was sitting in front of a room full of like 100 people and doing my talk about it, and say, like, no, if there's 100 people here now, human beings sat side by side in close quarters, staring ahead, quietly, calmly, looking at someone else talk. Like, chimps could not do that. You put 100 chimps in this room, and they give it half an hour, you'll have 50 chimps, and then 30 chimps, because there'll be blood and feces everywhere. I mean, I've done some tough gigs in my time, but they never actually got to that point, because chimps aren't like that. They can have like maybe 30 chimps around, and then they get really sort of frustrated and scared and angry because they're not used to it. Whereas we are intensely social. We have empathy, strong empathy. We can detect other people's emotional expression and share it without even thinking about it. So other people do shape us a lot. So yes, you can train yourself to be with someone who has been the source of trauma. It can be done, but there's also a question of, like, to what extent should it be done? If this person is a source of trauma, then being away from them is exactly what you should be doing, because that's our interpersonal connections are really important, are really profound and fundamentally affecting. If you meet them again and it's just you trying to be, like, I want to connect with you, but they have not changed, then it's not a good thing to want to sort of put up with them and tolerate them. You're basically re-exposing yourself to a noxious stimulus, essentially, and a powerful one, because other people are, other humans are like our main source of information from the world around us. So yes, you can do it. Your brain can do it. But then if that person is not making the same effort you are, then it's probably best that you don't, because the source of the trauma is still there. It's not actually changed. And you're basically sort of volunteering to re-experience it. And to what extent that, you might think that's a helpful thing, but how much of this is coming from you, or whoever, the royal you, whoever that happens to be, and how much is coming from societal expectations? Because we're so social, they shape us so much. Like, I've written about this, like the whole thing of the relationship escalator. That's what Dr. Peter Bunton called it. This idea that, well, I have to be with someone by age 22, and we have to be settled down by 25, and we have to be married by 26, and we have to have a first child before 30, and we have to live in the country by age 60. These are all societal objectives and ideas, but there's no actual biological reason for any of that. We are compelled to find someone, sure, but it's not like we aren't. There's no evolutionary driving factor behind, like, the retired by 60 house in the country sort of thing. It's just what we've learned to expect from others. So, and it's the same thing. Like, if you have a traumatic experience with someone who's close to you, or like someone who's traditionally a caregiver or provider, and we think, well, you have to be friends, you have to be close to your family because that's how it works. But you don't. And if that person is a cause of trauma, a cause of stress, then not having a relationship with them is just the most logical thing to do. And because, again, you think, because we absorb people, suffering people around us, we think, Well, I have to because it's my father, partner, brother, sister, wife, whatever. But again, that's not how it works. That's just other people saying that. To what extent is it the expectations of others and our own sort of drive to do that? Same with even more mundane things like, oh, I want to lose weight, I want to be in shape. Do you, or do you just think people want you to? That's what's done. Like, it's really important to try and separate that out. Or like the whole toxic positivity thing. I've always gone about that. Like the idea that you have to be happy, and if you're not happy, something's wrong. Is a really dangerous one. It's the brain does not do default happy. That's not what it's for. It's meant to be a reward state when good things happen. Being emotionally neutral is fine. Being unhappy sometimes, bad things happen because that's life. You should be able to react to that, saying that sucks. I hated that.
Yes.
And people say, well, everything happens for a reason. No, it doesn't. that bad thing happened. I'm not happy about it, and I'm going to express that. And that's how you should do it, because your brain has all these emotions, and suppressing any of them is just a recipe for disaster in the long term.
So this is part of what I'm trying to reprogram or recondition, depending on whether you're talking to me or my friend that I mentioned earlier. My brain I used to be very toxically positive. I had no idea that's what I was doing, but being able to be comfortable with feeling difficult emotions, and would love to ask you so much more about that, but we do only have 8 minutes left, and I do want to ask you about left and right versus but parts of the brain. So left brain versus right brain. Is there any difference? I feel like there is.
There is a difference according to the side of the data now. Now, I was sort of very skeptical about this, and I just looked at it away from my latest book, because the way it's portrayed in the mainstream is that left brain is analytical, right brain is emotional. And if you're like a left brain person, you're emotional, and if you're right brain, you're analytical, or whatever. Like you're a nerd or you're sort of logical. It's not that. That's a huge, at best, oversimplification. That it's actually more like just completely misleading. That doesn't do it well. So we do have a dominant hemisphere. Like the brain has two sides, and if you're right-handed, then your left side is dominant because it crosses over for reasons. And if you're left-handed, it's your right brain which is dominant, and those parts of the brain will take the lead when it comes to processing sensory stuff or language stuff. It's almost like the other hemisphere acts as a sort of backup in support. It's more to it than that, but it's it sort of takes second place to a lot of the processing. And it's interesting, like when you're a child, if you have a brain disorder, neurological problem, you can almost have one hemisphere completely removed and grow up to be totally normal because the other one just steps in and takes over. That's how flexible it is. There's a lot of redundancy in there. But according to the most of the data we see now is that, I hope we get this right way around now, but I believe it's the left brain is more big picture and the right brain is more fine detail. So in terms of all, like the left brain sees the woods, the right brain sees the trees. For want of that's quite a traditional example, because our sensory world is quite complex. It's made up of different elements, so the elements are important, but so is the wider picture. And the left brain sort of takes everything in and like, right, okay, so this is what I got to work with. What does all this mean? Whereas the right brain is more like the fundamental bits. And that's why the right brain can be perhaps seen as more emotional, because emotions are an underlying component of most of our experiences. So the right brain is responsible for that, whereas the left brain will do words and sentences. The right brain will do individual sounds and letters. So it's like it's processing the fundamental aspects of what we're experiencing. And it is a lot of debate and thinking about this, because I think it's what we're talking about. We're talking about a hemisphere here, which is a lot of brain. There's a lot going on in any hemisphere, and this to sort of give one hemisphere a specific function or a specific vibe, it's going to be it can't be accurate, because we're talking that's like 50 billion brain cells doing 600 different things at any 1 second. So they will have very, very different functions, and lots of things will go against that and not work that. But yes, there does seem to be a functional difference between the hemispheres, but it's a lot less sort of stark than the mainstream. Those quizzes you do: are you left brain or right brain? Or if you see this thing spinning, you are a left brain. But shut up. But there is something there. So there is sort of like there's a difference, but it's a more subtle and nuanced than most people would perhaps assume.
So Dean, I've only got another 4 minutes to ask you about 3,000 questions, but I'm going to focus on 3. So let's do some quick fire things, hopefully.
Okay.
So let's try. I'm doing a neurofeedback thing on Thursday where I'm getting my mind mapped. What is neurofeedback? What have I let myself in for?
Neurofeedback is basically a quite an intriguing way of therapy, that it sort of shows you what's going on in your brain when you're experiencing things like the levels or the neurotransmitter output or the electrical activity. When you experience, hopefully they'll say, like, can you think about this thing which is traumatic? And then your levels will go up. And they'll say, well, now focus on bringing those down. What it does essentially, and biofeedback's another thing, which is heart rate stuff, but same principle. It externalizes the issue. Rather than think to yourself, I want to suppress my emotions, I want to control this. It gives it a far more abstract, external, tangible thing. Like, okay, those waves are up, I need to bring those down. And then by doing that, it sort of makes it simpler and gives you a sense of control and understanding of it, which our brain really likes. Anything which reduces uncertainty, our brain really likes that, and it sort of seizes on it.
Great. Okay. That was really, really quick, which I really love.
Quick fire. I'm doing my best.
I'm really excited about Thursday, so I can't wait to chat to you afterwards, Dean, and be like, look at the map. I don't know what it means. Right. The pandemic. We mentioned about exposure therapy from other kinds of traumas, but how can we recover as individuals from our own traumas of the pandemic?
I think the first and foremost is important to acknowledge them, accept that they happened, accept that they were bad things, and you have to go through that. And I think that's a sort of going back to the positivity thing, which I've sort of kind of banged drum about this a lot, that this was a crap thing that happened to everyone. Some people had it worse, some people had it not so bad, but accepting it as a thing that was beyond your control is kind of healthy, because that's one thing our brain doesn't like: a lack of control, a lack of uncertainty. That's why you get conspiracy theories and like pointing the finger at, we can't live in a random world, it must be this to blame, it must be that to blame. That's our brain's defense mechanism, because we don't like random occurrences when they affect us, because that means we can't do anything about them, we can't plan for them, we can't brace for them. That's upsetting to your typical brain. And so I think first and foremost, accept that it happened, acknowledge it, be willing to say, yeah, that was tough, it affected me, and I've been worsened by it. Without doing that, I don't think you can ever really hope to come to terms with it, because I think everyone wants to go back to normal. Fine if you want the world to go back to normal, but that it's a short step from saying that to saying, and that never happened. It did happen, and we need to sort of keep that in our minds.
Okay, fantastic. I feel like we will talk about this some further. Final question before we are going to raid Robotron. Everybody who's watching, we're going to raid Robotron in a second because he's lovely. Final question: in your brain, Dean, where is hope? What happens when we feel hopeful? Where is hope in this?
You're not going to find one specific spot for it. It's a very complex cognitive construct, but it's going to be when you simulate and you extrapolate and you anticipate things, the outcomes which you like, and those will trigger like the reward pathway thing. That's the thing I want to happen, and I like thinking that will happen, and I'm going to make work towards that happening. It'll be motivating. Sort of like, here's an outcome I want to achieve. Here's what I've got to do to achieve it, and it's the sort of the brain going, yeah, okay, I'm going to work to make that happen, because that's an outcome I want to see in a tangible sense. And it's all to do with like the reward pathway deep in the midbrain. There's the forward-thinking extrapolation part from the frontal lobe, and like there's the emotional sensors in the amygdala and things like that, and the sensory aspects. So all your brain, to an extent, will be involved in hope, but they'll all be adding their own little 2 pence to it, and you end up with this hopefully inspiring construct which motivates you and gives you a reason to keep going.
I could talk to you for so long, Dean. I also really want you to help me find hope in my brain right now, because every time I find a bit of hope, it's like, oh no, that's wishful thinking. Oh no, that's a fantasy. Oh no, that's a memory. Okay, somewhere there's going to be hope. Right now, you've given me a hell of a lot of hope from this conversation, because yeah, you nearly made me cry with the idea that there is always hope, that we can reprogram, recondition, and although I do have to go to work after chatting to you today, I am going to devote further time and energy to reprogramming my brain, to creating this project Hopepunk for our future audiences. And I'm very excited to work with you further on it as well. So thank you so much for your time, Dean. Everyone who's watching, where can they go and find you on social media?
Usually Twitter is my go-to. It's at Garrowboy, Garwboy. The Garrow Valley is where I grew up, and I signed up to Twitter long before I thought anyone would care who I was. So that was, I thought I might be the first person from there to sign up. Don't know if I was or not, but I seem to have been stuck with the label now. But there's also deanburnett.com, my website for book things, articles, and so on like that. So yes, and I have some interesting projects in the next year, which I hope to let people know about very soon.
Well, I'm very excited to hear more about that. So thank you so much for joining me today. And I'm looking forward to reading your books very much. Thank you so much, guys. We're going to raid Robotron now, so everybody's watching, please do join us in a raid of Robotron, the lovely Robotron. Dean, thank you so much. We will be back interviewing. We're going to be back in a couple of weeks' time for the next Project Hopepunk interview, and for now you can watch back all of the interviews that we've done thus far on either my YouTube channel or on my Twitch channel. Thank you so much, Dean. Have a lovely day, and I will be speaking to you very soon. Thank you.
Speak to you soon. Bye bye.